The storm had been snarling around Pinehold all night, and by dawn it had swallowed the town whole. Snow came down in sheets, thick and blinding, and the wind howled through the empty alleyways like something alive. Inside the Pinehold Police Department, the space heater coughed and clicked in the corner, while the overhead lights buzzed in protest. The night shift was nearly over. Sheriff Aaron Callahan sat at his desk, flipping through half-filled reports and waiting for the coffee to kick in. Across from him, Rookie Officer Riley Finch rubbed his eyes, staring at a glitchy traffic cam feed on an old desktop monitor. He'd only been on the job 6 months and still kept a pocket notebook like it was gospel. Outside, the world had turned to white. Inside, the only sound was the static hum of silence until the door slammed open. Callahan looked up just in time to see a flash of movement, a blur of wet fur, claws skidding on the linoleum, snow melting into puddles beneath heavy paws. A German shepherd burst into the lobby, panting, eyes wide, soaked to the bone and trembling from the cold. Blood matted his left leg. His muzzle clamped tight around something small and pink. It wasn't a toy. It was a child's shoe mud-caked, blood-stained, and unmistakably real. Riley stood up so fast he knocked over his chair. What the? The dog didn't growl, didn't bark, just locked eyes with them both, chest heaving. He dropped the shoe at Riley's feet, took one staggering step back toward the door, and turned his head over his shoulder, then looked back. One glance, one command. Follow. Callahan's mouth went dry. 3 days earlier, they'd put out a statewide alert for Josie Ray Donovan, 8 years old, brown hair, last seen leaving her grandparents' cabin off Route 6 near Timber Run Forest. Her case had gone cold fast. No vehicle footage, no credible sightings, and no ransom demands. Just tire tracks and a scrap of pink cloth caught on a broken fence post. Now, a shepherd had just walked through the door carrying what looked like her shoe. Callahan didn't hesitate. Grab the tracker, load the SUV. We're going. Riley didn't argue. He reached for the emergency GPS unit, slid into his winter gear, and slammed the back hatch of the patrol truck shut. Callahan clipped a GoPro to the dash and jammed a thermos into the cup holder. Outside, the shepherd was already pacing, circling back toward the trees with slow, aching urgency. They didn't leash him, didn't try. They followed. For the first few miles, the dog moved along the edge of the road limping but relentless. His fur was caked in dried mud and ice. The pads of his paws cracked and raw. Yet he never stopped more than a few seconds, only enough to look back and confirm the headlights were still behind him. Then he pushed forward again, through snowbanks, across icy switchbacks, under broken limbs snapping in the wind. They passed the old ranger station at mile 12, past the gravel service road that hadn't seen traffic in months, past the deer trail where a hiker went missing last fall. At mile 30, Callahan gritted his teeth. 65 kilometers. That's what this dog's already done, and he's still going. Riley stared at the screen, watching the live GPS track jitter over topography that hadn't been mapped in detail since the early 90s. It's like he's retracing something, he muttered. Not just running, he's remembering. By mile 45, the roads vanished altogether. The SUV could go no farther. The GPS pinged once, then died. No signal, no bars. Callahan and Riley pulled on snow gear and strapped on their packs. The shepherd stood 10 yards ahead, chest rising and falling in heavy rhythm, then turned back once more and disappeared into the trees. They followed on foot. The forest swallowed them. The snow was deeper here, untouched. Pines loomed on either side like guards in mourning, and yet the shepherd moved with eerie certainty, pausing only to check behind him, then forging ahead into the silence. It was Riley who first noticed the sign's shredded tarp caught on a branch, a ring of ash where a campfire once smoldered, footprints half swallowed by new snow, then the blood, small drops, spaced unevenly, a trail. The dog began to whimper low in his throat, then picked up pace, bolting ahead. They found her just as the wind died. Behind a rock outcrop near a frozen creek, buried beneath brush and pine boughs, lay a small figure curled in on itself, unmoving. Her coat was torn. Her lips were blue, her skin pale. Josie. The shepherd lunged forward and nuzzled against her neck, whining softly. When there was no response, he laid his body over hers, as if willing her warmth to return. Callahan checked her pulse barely there. Riley radioed in, but the line cracked with static. "Too far," he said. "No signal." They worked quickly, emergency thermal blanket, hand warmers, CPR protocol. The shepherd never left her side, not even when they pulled her into Callahan's arms and began the hard trek back toward the ridge. By the time the airlift team reached them, Josie's breath had returned, thin, raspy, but steady. She was alive. The shepherd stood just beyond the floodlight's edge, eyes fixed on the girl. Riley turned to Callahan, his voice almost reverent. He didn't run for help. Callahan didn't look away. No, he chose it. The snow didn't stop. As the rotor blades of the airlift team whirred overhead and the medics worked over Josie's fragile body, Callahan stood at the tree line, arms crossed against the cold, eyes fixed not on the helicopter but on the shepherd. The dog hadn't moved. His fur bristled in the cold wind, his posture still intense like a statue carved from ice. He didn't tremble, didn't look away. As the stretcher lifted and disappeared into the fog, his head turned slightly, tracking her until the aircraft vanished into the sky. Callahan took a slow step forward. The dog didn't react. Behind him, Riley crunched over snow with the pack slung off his shoulder. "We should head back." "No," Callahan said, almost too quietly to hear. His eyes were locked on the spot where Josie had been found. The outcrop, the crushed brush, the barely extinguished ring of ash to the left. "We're not done." They retraced the shepherd's route not back to town, but deeper into the forest. The dog didn't lead them now. He walked beside Callahan, as if his job had shifted from guide to witness. The farther they moved into Timber Run, the stranger the silence became. Not just snow silence, the kind that presses against your ears. There were no bird calls, no animal sounds. Even the wind seemed to bend around the tree line as if avoiding the place. They found the tarp first ripped, shredded at the corners, one side pinned to the ground with a metal tent spike, the other twisted around a branch as though someone had grabbed it in a rush. Beneath it, an empty canteen, a balled-up fleece, and a child-sized sleeping bag smeared with something that had dried too dark to be dirt. Not far from the tarp was a half-dug fire pit, its center still faintly warm under the snow. Riley leaned down and pulled something from the ash, a melted crayon. Orange, half intact. Callahan didn't speak. They moved onward through thick underbrush. Ranger, the name had stuck now, even without confirmation, began to sniff again, low to the ground, tracking not with urgency but certainty. He paused near a pine trunk that bore long, jagged claw marks. At first, they assumed it was from an animal, but Riley stepped back, measuring the angle, the height. No, this was deliberate, defensive. Further along, they found something stranger. A wood sign, old, weather-warped, mounted crudely on a crooked post. Faded white paint read, Sector 17, Active Training Zone. Someone had tried to scratch out the wording with a knife. Underneath, a spray-painted warning in red, Stay back. Callahan frowned. There hasn't been training out here since '09, Riley said. That fire base was decommissioned years ago, supposedly cleared. And yet, here we are. The forest changed after that. Less wild, more arranged. Paths overgrown but visible. Large, rectangular stones that once formed foundations. Metal debris hidden under moss. And more signs, some rusted, others broken, all bearing coded tags, numeric sequences, and things that didn't belong in civilian space. It was here that Ranger began to pull ahead again. His stride lengthened, his tail dropped, his posture became sharper, like a switch had flipped. He wasn't just walking anymore, he was responding. Something was calling to him. A memory, maybe. A scent. Muscle memory woven into instinct. They followed him through a split in the ridge and down into a narrow gulch. It was there they found it. A hollow dug into the base of a rock face, partially concealed by fallen limbs and branches. Inside, a child's backpack, torn at the zipper. A pink hairbrush, socks, a tangle of cloth that had once been a small hoodie, and blood. Not fresh, but not old either. Smeared across the inside wall like someone had tried to claw their way out. Callahan knelt by the entrance. Riley didn't move. Neither did Ranger. Something was deeply wrong here. The sight wasn't random, it had structure. The backpack was placed just so. The hoodie folded, almost carefully. As if someone wanted the child to think she wasn't in danger. That this was just temporary. That she'd go home soon. But it was all an illusion. On the back wall, etched with something sharp, were 5 lines tallies scratched into stone. Maybe days. Maybe attempts. They didn't know. Ranger sat in the middle of the clearing now, staring at the entrance. Not whimpering, not growling. Waiting. Callahan stood slowly, brushing snow from his coat. He brought us here for a reason. Riley circled wide, checking footprints. Some old, melted into the earth. Some newer, smaller. This was more than a camp. It was a trap. Riley didn't answer. Suddenly, Ranger lifted his head, ears perked sharply east. His body went rigid. Then, without warning, he took off bolting towards the tree line, paws silent over snow. They followed. It wasn't far, barely 50 yards, but the trail curved around a thicket, and as they cleared it, they saw what he'd found. A tree, old and wide. Nailed to the trunk at eye level, a plastic sheet protector, yellowed with age. Inside, a child's drawing. A crayon sketch stick figures. A girl with pigtails holding hands with a tall man and a dog. Names written under each figure in a child's print. Me. Uncle D. Fire Dog. Callahan exhaled sharply. Ranger stepped forward and sat beneath the drawing, lifting his head as snow began to fall again. Whatever had happened here hadn't been random. This wasn't just a rescue. This was a reckoning that had been years in the making. And Ranger, whatever his past had been, had made a choice. Not just to run 65 kilometers, but to bring someone back to the truth. The machines blinked softly in the dark. In the pediatric intensive care wing of Ash Grove Medical Center, room 312 was quiet except for the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor and the gentle hiss of oxygen flowing through a nasal cannula. Josie Ray Donovan lay motionless beneath layers of warmed blankets, her small frame swallowed by tubes, gauze, and the faint smell of antiseptic. Her face was pale, lips cracked and dry, a bruise blooming across her temple like a forgotten shadow. The doctors had done everything they could. Fluids, heat blankets, stabilization. Her body was fighting, but time was thin. Even the staff didn't speak when they entered. They just moved carefully, glancing at the dog curled up by her bedside. Ranger hadn't left the room once. He lay with his muzzle draped over the edge of the bed, ears slightly cocked, tail still, eyes never closing for more than a second. Nurses came and went, tiptoeing around him. Some watched with awe, others with unease, but no one tried to move him. They knew better. He wasn't just watching, he was waiting. Outside the room, Dr. Lila Monroe leaned against the window, arms crossed, eyes heavy with the kind of fatigue that didn't come from lack of sleep, but from the weight of uncertainty. She was a trauma specialist with 15 years under her belt, but nothing in her training prepared her for the sight of a dog delivering a child to a sheriff's office. Nothing prepared her for the quiet resilience in that shepherd's eyes or the ache it stirred in her chest. The girl had no ID, no emergency contact, only her name, pulled from the missing persons bulletin Riley had flagged during the medevac flight. Josie Ray Donovan, age 8, last seen Friday afternoon. Gone for over 72 hours before being found beneath a blanket of snow and brush, barely breathing. Now, it was Monday, and she was still silent. Riley stood nearby, flipping through the preliminary case file intermittent cell pings near Timber Run, a report of a red pickup near Route 6, a vague eyewitness sketch too distorted by panic to be useful. Sheriff Callahan was back at the station, cross-referencing known offenders with any connection to the Timber Run fire zone. Nothing fit, not yet. It was just past 3 in the morning when Ranger lifted his head. No one had touched him, no sound had changed, but something in the rhythm of the machine shifted just slightly, and the dog responded like a string had been plucked inside him. He stood. The nurse, monitoring from the hallway, straightened in surprise, nearly dropping her tablet. Ranger placed both front paws on the bed, careful not to shift the mattress. His nose moved toward Josie's hand, resting limp against her side. Then her fingers twitched. It was barely a motion, a flutter, but it was enough. Ranger exhaled one low, breathy sound that wasn't a bark, but not a whimper either. Her lips parted, dry, cracked. Ranger. The whisper barely crossed the space between them, but it landed like a thunderclap. Dr. Monroe was inside the room in an instant, followed by the nurse, Riley at their heels. Monitors beeped more rapidly now. Josie's eyelids fluttered. One hand reached slowly toward the coarse fur beside her. Her fingers curled into it. "Vitals are climbing," the nurse breathed, heart rate stabilizing. Dr. Monroe didn't speak. She crouched beside the bed and gently touched the girl's shoulder. "Josie, can you hear me?" A pause, then a slow nod. Ranger pressed closer, his body tense but calm. Her hand moved again, now resting against the side of his neck. "He came back for me," she murmured. It took hours before she could speak more than a few words at a time, but every word she gave unraveled part of the mystery. The man had come to the cabin Friday morning. Said he was a friend of her uncle's. Claimed her grandparents had asked him to drive her to town because the roads were icing over. He seemed calm, friendly. He gave her a snack bar, told her he used to be a firefighter. She didn't remember much after that, only that the car smelled strange and the trees looked unfamiliar. He took her deep into Timber Run, set up camp beneath an old ridge, said they were waiting out the storm. But something about him cracked on the second day. He grew agitated, stared into the trees, talked to no one, then yelled a lot. When she cried, he tied her hands. When she screamed, he hit her. The last thing she remembered was his boot above her face. And then Ranger. She didn't know where he came from. Only that 1 second she was alone, the next, a blur of black and brown fur crashed through the tarp. She remembered teeth, growling, then warmth. She drifted in and out, felt the dog nudge her side, something tugging at her arm, cold air, pine needles. He dragged her to safety, tucked her beneath branches, left, came back, stayed beside her until help arrived. When Riley showed her the photo pulled from a community newsletter 2 years old, taken during a school visit by the State Fire Department's K-9 unit, her hand shot out and tapped the image. That's him. The patch on the dog's vest in the photo was faded but visible. Ranger, Oregon Fire Search Unit. A dog listed as missing after the Timber Run fire, presumed dead, never recovered. Dr. Monroe exhaled slowly and set the photo down. You remember him? I never forgot, Josie said. Outside the room, Ranger curled into the blanket someone had laid out for him and rested his chin between his paws. His ears twitched at every sound. His eyes stayed fixed on the doorway. He didn't need a medal, didn't need to be called a hero. He was waiting for her to heal. Because somehow, despite everything he'd endured, fire, abandonment, pain, he had found the one person who remembered his name. The woods didn't give up their secrets easily. In the days that followed Josie's awakening, Sheriff Aaron Callahan's office turned from a rural precinct into a full-scale command post. Pinboards filled with hand-drawn maps, footprints, satellite overlays, and printed screenshots from thermal drones covered the walls. And in the middle of it all, taped to a corkboard beneath the label Person of Interest, was a faded department photo of a man who had once worn the same badge Callahan now did. Dennis Cray, a former firefighter from Timber Run, 10 years in the service. Commendations for bravery, multiple rescues, and then tragedy. A cabin blaze on the north slope, no survivors, wife and daughter inside. The investigation was inconclusive. Cray walked away from the firehouse 2 weeks later and disappeared into what people called the timberline silence. No one had heard from him since. Until now. Josie's description had been vague. Uncle D, a man who smelled like old smoke and talked to things in the trees. She recalled rope, a red truck, and a song he hummed before falling asleep in the tent beside her. But the name Dennis hadn't passed her lips. What had connected the dots was Ranger. Callahan had sent the photograph to the Oregon Fire K-9 unit archives. Within hours, confirmation returned. Ranger had been part of Timber Run's unit under the direct command of Captain Dennis Cray. The dog had been presumed dead after the 2022 wildfire, listed as MIA. No microchip ever registered again. No sightings. Case closed, but Ranger hadn't died. He had been taken. Not adopted, not rescued. Kept. Somewhere between that fire and now, something had gone wrong in Cray's mind. And what he'd done to Josie was only a symptom of something much darker. Ranger had carried that memory in his silence, and now Josie's words gave it shape. Callahan and Riley pieced together timelines, fuel receipts from a town 30 miles east, a blurry security photo of a man buying canned soup in a hardware store, a call to a ranger outpost reporting a ghost cabin with signs of fresh activity clothing lines, smoke trails, a dog howl heard late into the night. The noose tightened slowly. Then came the break. A hiker reported a man fitting Cray's description boarding a late-night transport bus in Edgepine, less than 10 miles from Pinehold. The man had a duffel bag, heavy coat, and wore a fire rescue patch on his backpack. Inside that bag, when officers finally found him 2 days later at a station stop near Lewis Fork, they discovered a handful of children's drawings. Folded carefully, stored like treasure. One of them was Josie's crayoned stick figures labeled with crooked handwriting. Me, dog, and dad. He never ran. When they approached, he simply sat down, folded his hands in his lap, and whispered, "He came back, didn't he?" Ranger wasn't there for the arrest, but his presence loomed over every part of the case. Josie's story became national news within hours, but officials kept one detail quiet. Dennis Cray hadn't just trained rescue dogs. He'd once been hailed as the K-9 Whisperer in his unit. His methods were intense, effective, and private. Interviews with former teammates painted a picture of a man both gifted and haunted. After the loss of his family, something fractured. He withdrew from training sessions, talked about starting over, fixing things. When the fire took everything, some believed he set out to remake what he lost. Only he didn't want a new family. He wanted to rebuild one he could control. Ranger had been his last link to a life that made sense. And when even that slipped from his grip, the line between savior and captor disappeared. Back in Ash Grove, Josie's condition improved. Each day brought color back to her cheeks, steadier breath, and a bit more laughter, rare, quiet things that arrived like spring breaking through frost. Ranger remained at her side, now sleeping curled up beneath her bed or standing at the window as though guarding something sacred. Dr. Ray Voss observed her behavior with care. There was trauma, of course, but also resilience. Josie didn't flinch when recounting the night Ranger pulled her out. She didn't cry when she described Dennis's shouts or the cold forest. Her only moment of silence came when asked what she remembered about the fire. "I think he thought I was his daughter," she finally said. Voss wrote nothing, just nodded. Down the hall, Callahan handed Ranger a folded slip of paper. Josie's drawing from years before, the one that matched what they found nailed to the tree. Ranger took it gently in his mouth, then placed it on the floor beside his paw and laid his head across it like a flag. The past couldn't be undone, but maybe, in the quiet places where monsters once hid, something else had taken root. A choice, a memory, a dog who didn't forget who he was even when the world tried to make him something else. The snow had melted. Not completely, but enough that the ground began to remember its color. Brown and brittle beneath the trees, slushy along the sidewalks of Pinehold, Oregon. The storm had passed, though the cold still lingered, hanging onto the window panes of Ash Grove Medical like it didn't want to leave. Inside room 312, spring had already arrived in small, quiet ways. Josie Donovan sat upright in her hospital bed, crayon clutched in one hand, her other resting absent-mindedly on the head of the dog curled beside her. Ranger didn't move much anymore, not because he couldn't, but because he didn't need to. She was safe now, and safety for him was enough. The drawing she worked on was simple: a girl, a house, and a dog under a tree. But unlike the others, this one had a sun-bright yellow and impossibly large. She didn't look at what she was sketching. She just drew, like memory had finally shifted into something else. Across the hall, Dr. Monroe reviewed the final notes. Josie was medically cleared for discharge. Her wounds had healed, at least the ones the charts could measure. The rest would take time. The decision now rested with the state. Ordinarily, a child in Josie's situation would be transferred into protective custody until next of kin could be found or evaluated. But Josie had made one thing abundantly clear to every doctor, nurse, and social worker who entered that room. Ranger goes with me. The request had been simple. The process behind it, anything but. Sheriff Callahan spent 3 days combing through old K-9 registration logs, rebuilding the chain of custody for a dog who technically didn't exist anymore. Ranger had been declared deceased in 2022. No chip. No handler on file. No active record. A ghost. But ghosts, as it turned out, could still leave paw prints. With the help of Riley Finch and a retired trainer named Clay Henson, who confirmed Ranger's identity through archived footage and voice response trials, a petition was drafted and submitted to the Oregon State Family Court. Attached to it was a single-page testimony written by Josie herself, dictated slowly to Dr. Voss, printed in uneven font. He saved me because someone taught him how. He came back because he chose me. That's not just memory, that's love. It didn't take long for the judge to sign. Ranger was officially reassigned, no longer listed as Canine Search and Rescue, but as a registered emotional support animal under special protective care. Josie was granted provisional custody under state observation, pending permanent placement with her relatives in Bend. The badge they made for him was mostly ceremonial. Polished metal on a leather strap, it bore a simple inscription: Search and Protect, Timber Run Unit Retired, Hero of Pinehold. The morning she left the hospital, the entire town seemed to pause. Nurses lined the hallway, security paused their radios. Outside, a quiet crowd had formed at the curb. Coats zipped high against the chill. Holding paper signs and cell phones, no one cheered. They just stood. Josie stepped through the double doors with Ranger at her side. No leash, no vest, just a slow, steady gait as if they'd done this walk 100 times before. He wore the badge on his collar. She wore a smile that hadn't been there a week ago. The cameras caught that image. The girl and her dog framed by melting snow, her small hand resting gently on his head, his eyes forward, unshaken. But what they didn't capture was what happened the night before. In the quiet, when the machines were off and the halls were dark, Ranger had stood up from his spot, paced once around Josie's bed, and walked to the window. He sat there for almost an hour, looking out into the dark. Maybe at the stars. Maybe into memory. Maybe both. And when he returned to her side, he didn't lie down right away. He placed his head on her chest, just above her heart, like he was reminding himself what it meant to hear that beat again. That he had made it in time, that he had done enough, because in the end it hadn't been commands that led him 65 kilometers through a snowstorm. It hadn't been training or instinct or muscle memory. It had been choice. The choice to remember. The choice to protect. The choice to love, even when the world had tried to make him forget how. Ranger hadn't just saved Josie, he'd saved himself. And no matter how far the road or how deep the woods, he'd made it home again.